History is just packed with these incredible ironies, right? Moments where a decision meant to lock down power forever actually ends up planting the seeds of its own downfall. And the story of the British Raj in India, well, it's one of the most powerful examples of this. It brings up a really fascinating question. And that's the big question we're diving into today. We're going to explore how the very systems the British built to control an entire subcontinent were, in a wild twist of fate, picked up and used against them to win independence. So, our story really kicks into high gear in 1858. A massive, incredibly bloody revolt had just ripped through India, shaking the very foundations of British power. It was a wake-up call that forced London to completely change its game plan. See, before this, it was a private corporation, the East India Company, that was basically running the show. But the 1857 revolt proved that was just way too risky. So, with this act, London stepped in. They got rid of the company and took direct imperial control. And just like that, the British Raj officially began. Now, with direct rule, you need a new system. So the British got to work building a highly efficient, top-down machine designed for one thing and one thing only: total control over this vast, complex land. And the structure they built was honestly a masterpiece of authoritarian control. Think of it like a pyramid. All the power flowed from London. The Secretary of State, sitting in the British cabinet, gave orders to the Viceroy in India. The Viceroy then told the governors what to do, and the governors oversaw the district collectors. It was this super rigid hierarchy with absolutely no real Indian representation anywhere near the top. The engine that made this whole machine run was the Indian Civil Service, the ICS. This was the famous steel frame of the Raj, an elite group of administrators who made British policy happen on the ground. But here's the catch. Getting in was next to impossible for Indians. The entrance exams were held only in London, which pretty much guaranteed it would stay an exclusive British-dominated club. The British also built all this impressive infrastructure. We're talking railways, telegraph lines, massive ports. But make no mistake, this wasn't really for India's development. These were the arteries of the empire, designed to do two things: suck raw materials out to the ports and move troops in quickly to crush any sign of trouble. So, you have this incredibly efficient imperial machine. But what was the actual impact on the people and the economy of India? Well, the cost was absolutely staggering. What this machine did was completely rewire India's economy. It took a country famous for producing high-quality textiles and turned it into a supplier of raw materials for factories back in Britain. Then, India became a captive market, forced to buy back the finished clothes and goods from Britain. It was a one-way street of value, a system later called the drain of wealth. The human cost of this system, it's hard to even comprehend. The British pushed for cash crops like indigo and opium because they made money, but this often came at the expense of growing food. This made the population incredibly vulnerable. Famines became a horrific recurring tragedy. The 1943 Bengal famine alone killed an estimated 3 million people. But now, this is where the story takes that ironic twist we talked about, because the very tools the British used to secure their rule were about to be picked up, repurposed, and used to forge a new nation. Okay, let's start with education. The British set up a Western-style education system, and their goal was pretty straightforward. They wanted to create a class of English-speaking Indians who could work as clerks and junior officials. A loyal workforce to help run the colonial administration. But oh, did that backfire? Spectacularly. Because this new educated class wasn't just learning accounting. They were reading John Locke and Thomas Paine. They were reading about liberty, democracy, and self-determination. So instead of creating loyal clerks, the system produced the intellectual giants of the independence movement, guys like Dadabhai Naoroji, who used his British education to mathematically prove the economic exploitation of the Raj. And from this educated class, an organized resistance started to grow. And remember all that infrastructure, those railways built to move troops? Well, now, nationalist leaders were using them to travel and coordinate protests across the country. And English, the language meant for administration, became the common language that united Indians from different regions. The very tools of control were becoming the tools of liberation. So, when independence finally came in 1947, after nearly a century of direct rule, the legacy that the British left behind was incredibly complex, a real mix of modern institutions and some very deep scars. It really was a double-edged sword. On one hand, you have a centralized administration, a modern education system, and all that infrastructure.
But on the other hand, this all came at the immense price of economic exploitation, the total suppression of political freedom, and the deepening of social divisions that would have tragic consequences down the line.
And even the political reforms they introduced, like setting up legislative councils, were always a step behind what people were demanding. They were designed to manage dissent, to give the appearance of progress, while making absolutely sure that the ultimate control stayed firmly in British hands. It delayed true self-rule for decades.
So in the end, the legacy of the Raj isn't some simple story of good guys and bad guys. It's a complicated, messy inheritance of institutions built for control that were then used for freedom. And it leaves us with this huge question, one that nations all over the post-colonial world are still grappling with today.